in talking about anti-clericalism before the Reformation, or anti-clericalism and anti-papalism, I'll discuss what the differences are. I want to trouble, as you just said, this kind of memeified idea that everything was great and that the Roman Catholic Church was this solid, stable, untroubled entity, and then 1517 comes along and then it gets destabilized.
Welcome back to the channel, everybody. My name is Javier Perdomo. This channel's a place where we like to do theology videos, church history videos, and Reformation apologetics videos. And with us today, we have a special guest. We have Meun Maldonado. She's a PhD candidate in English and comparative literature at Columbia University, where she is completing her dissertation on the overlap of magic and theology in Middle English Romance. Her broader work looks at medieval and early modern theologies, the instability of medieval and early modern racial categories, and the sacramental potential of weird foods, things, and bodies in medieval literature. You can find her public-facing work on YouTube and X, or Twitter, for those of us still using the, the OG name, under the handle at Meggyvalist. How are you doing, Meun?
Doing all right. I'm, plugging away on my dissertation for the millionth year in a row, so I'm, having a great time. How are you?
Doing pretty well. Thank you so much for being with us today. Just to
Mhm.
fill everybody in at home before you jump into your presentation, the reason I reached out to you, so you have plenty of great, tweet posts, I
Ah,
guess, or tweet threads is what I was looking for on
mhm.
Twitter. People should definitely check out your content there.
Oh,
And
thanks.
you had one that was kind of like an introduction to a lot of these different texts in medieval literature that were anti-clerical or anti-papalist in nature. And the reason why I reached out to you is that it's very often that we get this picture painted online by misinformed Roman Catholic laymen of like this beautiful, almost like pristine medieval church, right, which is like
Mhm.
marred and shattered
Yeah.
by the evil Protestant reformers,
Yeah.
and that's not very accurate. And so I was just hoping that with your presentation today, I thought it would be an interesting angle to hear, from the literary side of things, not just from the theological treatise and on a political treatise side of things, but from like a strictly like literary angle. I thought it'd be good to hear about what's going on in the Middle Ages prior to and leading up to the Reformation. All right, and then I'm gonna get out of your way and let you get to it.
All right. Thank you. Yeah. Quite the introduction. Yeah, I'm a loudmouth on Twitter, and my training is in literary studies, in medieval literature, medieval English literature primarily, but with the whole complet part, I do go beyond England's borders. So, in talking about anti-clericalism before the Reformation, or anti-clericalism and anti-papalism, I'll discuss what the differences are. I want to trouble, as you just said, this kind of memeified idea that everything was great and that the Roman Catholic Church was this solid, stable, untroubled entity, and then 1517 comes along and then it gets destabilized. So if we go on to the next slide, I want to first kind of talk about what, oh yes, this is the outline for today. We're going to talk about what's medieval first, like what I mean by that word. It's not always obvious to everybody. Then I'll explain why I think medieval literature is a useful angle to approach this conversation. Then I'll give some anti-clericalism exempla, some anti-papalism exempla. This is all within literature, fictional works of literature, cultural impact in the period, and then takeaways for today by looking at this kind of stuff. So, next slide, please. Okay, what is medieval? Middle Ages or Medium Aevum. What is the Middle Ages? What are we in the middle of? The end of the Roman Empire, 476. So if you want to say just the year 500 is a neat, maybe more memorable number, all the way up to 1500 is kind of the beginning for everybody at that point in Europe of the early modern period. Now, this is not itself a very set and stable category. It's another kind of historical myth. There are these subdivisions of the Middle Ages, and even those subdivisions that are temporal also get troubled when you're looking at different geographies. So on this slide here, I have the early medieval period, which has, starts at the fall of Rome. You have the Byzantine Empire going, you have the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne gets crowned in Christmas Day 800. You have the Viking expansion. You have the High Middle Ages from about 1000 to 1300. You have the East-West Schism here, so the break. We have had a Catholic Church, kind of, yes, but then we're getting more into Roman Catholicism. Population growth, Crusades, rise of the universities. 1300 to 1500 is late medieval, so-called. This is a time where you have, let's say, some widespread instability, although we certainly had some instability before. Great Famine, Black Death, the Western Schism. This is the two popes, one in Avignon, France, one in Rome, and the Reconquista, trying to get Spain back from the Muslim invasion. And then the early modern period, like I said, even though different countries, different geographies, and territories have different ideas about when their Middle Ages were and when their Renaissances were, definitely I would say by 1500, by the beginning of the 16th century, just about everybody's entering into their early modern period out of the Middle Ages. Now, why am I going through all this? First of all, to make sure that we're clarifying terms, usually helpful. But I want to highlight a few things here. And if you see me looking, I'm consulting my separate notes. Look at all these different moments of instability here. We have, with the rise of Charlemagne, it's not really a revival or a reformation, but certainly a committed institutional political affirmation of interest in prioritizing the faith. You have the East-West Schism in this high medieval period. You have the Western Schism in the late medieval period. What I'm pointing out by looking at this timeline, which is reductive in ways and overly simplistic, is that the Reformation is not the first moment of theological and institutional instability for the Roman Catholic Church or within Europe, certainly. So we have lots of historical things that are troubling everyday people's sense of reality, of what institutions, who has institutional authority. If you have two popes, who are you trusting, and how much should you be unquestioning with these authorities? So I think it's important to recognize that when we're talking about medieval, yes, it's all predating the Reformation, just about anywhere you are in Europe, but also we're still experiencing lots of theological institutional instability, even leading up to the Reformation, and that's important to remember as we look through some of these literary exempla. All right, can we move on to the next slide, please? Now, why medieval literature? Not history, not theological treatises. One, I'm a literary scholar, not a historian, so I'm already, at my wit's end going through all this history. It's not normally my field. I need to have some facility, obviously, in history, but I think it's important to look at medieval literature, not just because it's my training, but also because looking at works in the period, and when I say literature, I'm talking about fictional works that are, let's say, produced or maybe predominantly read by lay people. That's, literature is a kind of broad category, but that's what I mean when I'm talking about literature today. Why look at literature? I think it gives you something that a theological treatise or a secondary work of historical, scholarship or review is not going to give you. There's something I think about looking at what lay people, predominantly lay people, not exclusively, looking at what they're interested in, looking at what, not maybe the peasantry, because they're not literate, they're not the ones writing these works, and maybe not the ones listening to them being read aloud, but you have people who are not clerics. You have people who are not necessarily at the highest level of leadership, either in their governments or in the church, who are engaging with the material, both writing it and reading it. And what are they concerned with? What are they doing? That's kind of material that we don't get in, I think, theological treatises and debates, scholastic and whatnot. So I think that's why the literature, the literary angle is useful for this conversation of asking, well, what was it like before the Reformation? How were things going with the Roman Catholic Church and with the papacy? And the answer is not always great. So let's get into some of those examples in the next slide. Now, I said I was going to define terms, and I'm doing a lot of that, so I may as well keep going. Anti-clericalism, what do I mean by that versus anti-papalism? Well, anti-clericalism is a term that gets used a lot in scholarship, but let's just say that it's any kind of sentiment that expresses a dissatisfaction with or a critique of clerics, and I would say people who are more at the ground level, lower level of the ecclesiastic hierarchy. So we're looking at, let's say, your monks, your friars, your random nuns, prioresses, partners, whoever. More like on the ground people that the laity at different levels would be encountering on a more day-to-day basis. Nobody's running into the Pope on the side of the road, right? But you might encounter some friar who's mendicant and just out and about. So that's what I mean by anti-clerical. I'm also going to approach this whole talk not as necessarily the final word on how things were in the Middle Ages. It's really hard to make broad, sweeping statements and descriptions about how things were going for everyone, absolutely. But what I am going to do is I'm going to present evidence that's going to trouble, like we talked about in the beginning, trouble the idea that there's this really integral, constant Roman Catholic Church that is not experiencing any kind of instability or isn't experiencing any kind of proto-Reformation, much of anything except for some one-offs here and there. My goal for today is to show you in these examples that yes, there were endemic problems and people noticed them. Faithful Catholics noticed them. And when you start to pick up on these patterns, the Reformation starts to seem a lot more inevitable, I'd say, but we can get to kind of my sweeping judgments more at the end. So I have some visual examples here. These two images are from manuscripts, actually from one manuscript, the Ellesmere Chaucer. This is over at the Huntington Library now, but this is from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. We have, I think this is the friar and the summoner, yes. Now, I'm not going to regale you with these stories individually. Just so you know, the Canterbury Tales are hugely popular. Long story short, the gist of the whole frame tale is that you have all these different pilgrims coming together. They want to go on a pilgrimage to Canterbury, so obviously a very Roman Catholic setting. You know, we're taking pilgrimages, and that itself is a holy work. And in that, you have a number of people. Not everybody is part of the church, but there are a number of people who are. And almost all of them are presented with some kind of hypocritical flair. Now, Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote this in England, and he wrote this in the late 14th century, so about 1390-ish. Geoffrey Chaucer is not a proto-reformer. No one could characterize him as that. As far as we know from his life and from his works, he was a pious man. We have no reason to believe otherwise, really. So this is not somebody who's writing critically of people who are within the church from the position of somebody who is against the church itself as an institution. And that's something else I want to make clear. Having anti-clerical sentiments in literature doesn't mean that the author himself wanted to leave the church or wanted some kind of, let's call it a schism or call it a big Reformation movement. Yet there are still patterns that we can observe, like in the Canterbury Tales and other texts, that point to some pretty systemic problems. So let me get specific here with Canterbury Tales. There's one good cleric. He's the parson. He is the exception to the rule. He actually has the concluding tale, which is more of a sermon in the Canterbury Tales. Just about everybody else that's from the church is not a good representative of the church as an institution. So you have the prioress, who in the general prologue is described as giving little dainty white bread to her little lapdog. Why is that bad? Well, we've just come out of peasants' revolt, famine, and plague, and food is not totally abundant, let's say, yet she has the money to have a little lapdog and have nice white bread, which is more expensive to make than it is today. You have the monk who likes to go hunting, and he likes to tend to his multiple dogs and his multiple horses. Monks aren't supposed to have enough money to be able to purchase multiple dogs, multiple horses, and they're not supposed to be spending their time hunting. Chaucer is brilliant in that his satires of these people, these satirical representations, they're not very on the nose, like, look how bad, and they're doing the wrong thing. He, extols how lovely the aesthetics of their lifestyles are, with the implicit reading being, yeah, they're not supposed to be living like this. You're not supposed to see monks and prioresses in this kind of extravagant way. You have the summoner, who is this little dude here with the envelope in his hand. The summoner is like somebody who delivers summons, legal summons to somebody else, and He gets in a little tiff with the friar, who is also there on a horse, and he describes entering hell. I'm going to echo the language of the text. He describes entering hell, and you see Satan. Satan lifts up his tail, and he describes a bunch of friars, like almost like a beehive, flying out of Satan's, and the word is erse, so flying out of Satan's ass and moving around, going everywhere, and then flying back in. And so this is, and it's funny, right? This is funny. The prioress feeding her little lapdog while people are kind of starving. It's kind of dark humor. You have, who else did I mention? The monk. The reason that these are all kind of intuitive jokes about how people of the clerical classes can be, it's intuitive and funny because everyone's dealing with it. I mean, think about memes that you might be sharing today about how things are going politically. Let's say you make a meme about, I don't know, spending $100 at the grocery store and it's a picture of like two things. You share that not because you're expecting some great radical change politically, maybe. It wouldn't be realistic to expect it. You're sharing it because it's funny, and it's funny because everyone else is dealing with it, or most other people around you are dealing with it. So when we're looking at the humor of Chaucer and these anti-clerical representations of these different people, we're getting a humor that's indicative of, I would say, a widespread awareness and likely a concern with what's going on with all these different people. And I think the number of different people within the clerical class, these different positions, the monk, the friar, the prioress, when you have in sum all these different people coming together in this place, and it's intuitive that they would be doing these kind of extravagant things, it speaks to, I think, a larger concern that these are not one-off bad examples, right? These are not exceptions, but everybody else is doing a good job within the church. I think the pattern here in the Canterbury Tales is saying, no, actually, it's pretty widespread. Like almost no matter who you run into, you're going to see that there's some form of corruption. And the corruption is often financial that's represented, at least in the Canterbury Tales and also in other texts. You know, having so much money that you can get your little pets and you can spend your time hunting and you have lots of horses and dogs and whatever. There's also the partner who is not, I haven't mentioned yet, but the partner is somebody who goes and confesses, gives sacrament of confession and absolution, but the partner is known for kind of preaching against greed while extorting people for money. There's the kind of implicit thing that, hey, I know your sins, give me some money, so it's a donation. I'm not going to say anything. Money and financial corruption and greed, I'll call it, is a through line also. So it's not just, yeah, it's funny because we're all dealing with it, that kind of memeified reaction to a widespread problem. But what is the widespread problem? A lot of it has to do with greed. Another example, excuse me, a little bit earlier than Chaucer. The Roman de la Rose, it's by Guillaume de Lorris and Jean de Meun, and my French pronunciation is terrible. This is French, 13th century text, pretty famous, Roman de la Rose. Chaucer would have been familiar with it, but it still predates him, so they're not in conversation with each other, let's say. There's a Franciscan friar whose name is False Seeming, so a little more on the nose. His name is False Seeming, and there's a lay sister, a Begin, who's named, or Constrained Abstinence. So False Seeming and Constrained Abstinence, you can probably tell where this is going. Excuse me. You have constrained abstinence. She likes to pretend that she doesn't eat food, she doesn't have sex, she is somehow pregnant underneath all of her robes, but she's able to conceal it because of what she wears. You have the corrupt friar. He's taking money from parishioners through extortion, kind of similar to the partner in Chaucer. Again, are these one-off examples? Are they more indicative of a larger problem? I think they're presented as funny. It's a different kind of humor. Maybe not everybody finds it funny, but I think it's intended to be humorous in the way you see this kind of crass Halloween costumes with the pregnant nun. Like, there's a kind of humor about it, and what is the humor? We all know what's going on. We all kind of see it. It's just kind of giving a more personified and embodied presentation of the joke, giving it a kind of face so that we can all laugh at it. And a final example I want to give of anti-clericalism, El Libro de Buen Amor by Juan Ruiz. This is out of Spain, mid-14th century. This is a satirical commentary, kind of pseudo-biographical text. He has these lusty and hypocritical clerics, but Ruiz himself was actually an archpriest, so he is a clerical example. The other two are not. Suffice it to say, these are examples from where? England, France, Spain. We're not in the same geography, we're not in the same century for all of these, though we will talk about why these all seem to be clustered around the 13th, 14th centuries. But nevertheless, you have these through lines of, yeah, there's some other kind of random sins these people are doing, but it's almost like no matter who you're running into, whether it's, some random friar, some random sister, a pardoner, a monk, whoever, they're all taking advantage of their positions somehow, and they're often doing so in a way that feeds their greed. This is not just, this is an endemic problem, I should say. I think these authors are not saying, therefore, we want a reformation. I'm not going to go ahead and make that claim. Nevertheless, these examples are making light of a really endemic and systemic problem within the Catholic Church. So if we're asking ourselves, okay, well, why did Luther come along in 1517 and start this Reformation? What was he doing? Everything was fine until then. I mean, there were people, everyday people, not everyday peasants, certainly. If you're literate and you're writing, you're not an everyday person in the sense that you're very poor, but an everyday person and that you don't have a lot of control over a larger society. And you're noticing these widespread issues, and a lot of other people are noticing them too, and you don't even know. Like, these examples are not all connected to each other. They're not all in conversation. There's no conspiracy here to start making a bad light out of what's going on with these clerics. It's just a known fact. And we have to ask ourselves, was the Reformation so out of the blue? Did it just, come about with this monk, whatever they say about Luther, or friar, excuse me, that he, just wanted to get married or something? I can't keep up with all the weird memes that they make about him, but is it just that this dude wanted to start doing new stuff with the church? Or had a lot of people been saying, there are lots of problems here, and somebody came along at the right time to actually say something that was more effective? So these are all anti-clerical examples, but I want to get into some anti-papal examples now. What I mean by anti-papal, as you might guess from the term, is not just we're critiquing clerics at the ground level here and there. We're actually giving critiques of higher ecclesiastical order, people higher up in the food chain, the Pope, more specifically, or popes and cardinals and bishops, people who are actually in charge of things. But definitely we have some critiques of some popes as well. Now, let's observe this beautiful image here. I love this because it's Dante. This is a Gustave Doré's woodcut. This is the Canto 19 of the Inferno. Yes. He's kind of like looking in. He looks a little petty there. I love it. That's Virgil beside him, guiding him through hell. So this is out of the Inferno, as I said. And what you see in these little feet here, sticking out in these legs, this is the third bolgia of the 8th circle. Bolgia's little pocket. So like there's little pockets all throughout the 8th circle of hell, and this one is dedicated to the simoniacs. A simoniac is somebody who commits the sin of simony. What is simony? Well, if you read Acts, the book of Acts in the Bible, you have Simon Magus, who wants to buy from Peter the ability to facilitate the work of the Holy Spirit by the laying on of hands. He wants to buy that, and so a simoniac, or the sin of simony, is when you are trying to have some kind of exchange of spiritual goods for temporal goods. It's kind of capacious definition there, but that's essentially what this is. And whom he's observing, is Nicholas III, Pope Nicholas III. Now, there's a meme about Dante that he just puts people in hell that he doesn't like. That's absolutely not true. I mean, he doesn't like these people, but that's neither here nor there. He's observing in various places and in various people, including popes, including other high-ranking people who are respected in Florentine society or beyond. What he's doing is he's citing their sin, and he's very specific and very poetic about what is the nature of the sin and how they're going to be punished. So Nicholas III here it's already kind of scandalous to put a pope in hell at all. But what's funny also is that, if I remember correctly, Nicholas calls out to Dante and he mistakes Dante for Boniface VIII, Pope Boniface VIII, who had recently deceased prior to Dante finishing the Divine Comedy. But Nicholas calls out because he's anticipating that Boniface, who is another pope, Boniface VIII, will be going into hell basically for the same sin. In Canto 7, Circle 4 of the Inferno, Dante also sees unnamed popes and cardinals. It says in plural, seeing popes and cardinals in this circle of hell that's dedicated to greed. So this is a previous circle that he's already walked through where he already saw an unnamed and innumerable, apparently, unnamed and innumerable popes in the circle for greed. And now we're here in this other circle dedicated to simony, this little bulge dedicated to simony, and we have at least one pope and another one that we're anticipating is along the way. Now, why do this? Dante is not just putting people he doesn't like in hell, and Dante is, as far as we know, a super pious man. I absolutely do not believe that Dante was against the Roman Catholic Church as an institution. So when I present him giving some anti-papal sentiment, I'm not saying he was against the institution of the papacy. But it's complicated because he's not against it. He's quite a pious dude and very faithful to this institution. And I think his love for the institution is really at odds here with this tension where you see so many people, not just random people, not random friars you're encountering or a random nun or whatever, people at the very top of this institution for a long time, even up to very recently to when he was still alive, this pope that had just died, Boniface VIII. There's all these different people who are still so invested in greed, and it keeps happening over and over and over again. He names, or he doesn't name cardinals, but he, like individually, but he says that there are a bunch of cardinals in that circle dedicated to greed as well. There's an ongoing problem that even somebody as pious and loyal to the Roman Catholic Church as Dante is still feeling compelled to call it out and say, look, this has been going on. Now you might say, or let's say a random online friendly anonymous papist might say, well, nobody ever said that they were not fallible or, whatever. Yes, there's still issues that we're trying to reform from within. But the whole line, the whole metaphor throughout this Canto 19, when he's encountering these simoniacs here, Dante uses this extended metaphor of this bride who is prostituted out by the bridegroom. And the extended metaphor being the church over and over and over again keeps getting maligned and corrupted by all these men who are supposed to be in charge of the church as an institution. And so you can say, well, we didn't really say that they were infallible, but, we're trying to fix things. There was what efforts to fix things. He's observing over and over and over again, there are these problems. Now, Dante is an author who had been exiled for political reasons from Florence. I don't think he was intending to start a Reformation. I don't think he would have been the person to start it anyway. But it's hard to see something like this from such a pious man and say, well, no, there weren't any long-standing problems, or there weren't any really deep-seated problems until Luther came along. It's hard to make that argument, especially reading Dante. Now, I do have some other examples as well. We have the Roman de Fauvel, again, French, sorry for my pronunciation. It's 14th century, attributed to Gervais Dubout. This is about a horse named Fauvel. Fauvel, the name, is actually an acronym of the French words for, what are they? Flattery, avarice, vileness, fickleness, envy, and laxity. Those are the English words, obviously, but he's basically the embodiment of vice. And he's also a horse for humorous reasons, I suppose. He gets set up by Dame Fortune to leave the stable, and he goes to live in this grand house And in this grand house, in his bathroom, he has all these clerics that reside in the toilet to clean his feces off of him. He gets visits from both political and religious leaders. They make pilgrimages to this horse to see him, and they even bow to him. And so when you have the image, not naming popes specifically in the way that Dante does, but you have ecclesiastical authorities coming to the embodiment of vice and bowing to him, it's a more humorous example than we get in Dante. Dante's pretty specific, and he's not having a great time. He's not laughing, with his demoniacs. But with this French example, you get kind of similar to what we saw with somebody like Chaucer, of this humorous and intuitive understanding that it's not just random clerics that you're seeing around, but ecclesiastical authorities who are so dedicated and so enamored with the vice that they would come and even bow to it. Now, you can say, well, maybe it's an exaggeration for humorous effect, and maybe nobody's thinking that they're literally going bowing to a horse, right? But again, why is it funny? Why are things like this funny? And even if it's not funny to you, why would it have been funny to somebody reading this and somebody writing it? Why are memes funny today that we share that are political in nature? Because we get it, because we're all dealing with it and experiencing it. And if you don't have any way of affecting it, you can at least make a joke about it, right? I think that's something about humor that we should keep in mind. Something else, another humorous example, the Decameron by Boccaccio. This is also Italian. This is mid-14th century. The first day, this is a series of tales that people tell while the plague is going on. And so on the first day, the second story that somebody tells is about a Christian man trying to convert a Jewish man named Abraham. Why not? Trying to convert Abraham to Christianity. And so Abraham says to this Christian guy, whose name is Jehannet, I think I'm pronouncing it right. So Abraham says to Jehannet the Christian, he says, okay, if you want to convert me to Christianity, fine. Let me be convinced, though. I'm going to go to Rome, and when I see how people are living there, if I see that they're pious and all that, I'm going to be convinced, then I'll convert. So Jehannet hears that Abraham wants to go to Rome, which is obviously the seat of the papacy, right? And Jehannet freaks out. He's like, oh my god, if he goes to Rome, then he's going to see how corrupt everything is, and he's never going to convert to Christianity. And I mean, think about that. It's funny. Like, the joke is, if he goes to the heart of my religion, he's not going to want to convert. He tries to convince Abraham not to go. Abraham's so like, nah, I'm going to go. Abraham goes, he comes back, and he says, it was so corrupt. It was wretched. Says, I'm going to convert. And I'm going to convert because they were doing so well financially that even, with all their wickedness, they were still so blessed financially that, this has to be the one true religion. Of course I'm going to convert. Let's get baptized right away. So the joke here, well, a couple jokes. One of them is, a little anti-Semitic, right? The idea that this Jew is so motivated by his love of money that that's what's persuading him to convert to the faith. But also, what an indictment against the papacy itself at that time. It's a kind of weird joke that I think some people online probably wouldn't like today. The idea that this greedy Jewish man was so enamored with the greed of Rome that the two just are intuitively going together. And so you have, yes, this maybe we might call it anti-Semitic joke, but you also have this anti-papal joke, and they work together really well, which is an interesting angle. I can't think of a lot of examples of literature that have a kind of intuitive parallel between the kind of greed, the stereotypical greedy Jew and the stereotypical greedy Roman Catholic cleric. If anybody has an example, please let me know. But that's one in the Decameron that sticks out. There are other funny and weird and kind of gross tales from other people in the Decameron. You have some nuns who are all trying to sleep with the same man because they all think he's mute and he's not telling anybody else. And so there's other kinds of sins featured in the Decameron and other works. It's a little more anti-clerical than anti-papal. But in these three examples, in Dante and Boccaccio, and in who was the Roman de Fauvel, you have the target more the institution, the hierarchy, the popes, and the people in charge of the church, the Roman Catholic Church, the canonical authorities, let's say, you have them as the targets. So it's not, I've made this point a few times, but I think it's worth repeating. We're not just critiquing, oh, there are some people who are bad, you know, everybody's sinful. Sometimes you're going to encounter somebody who's bad. It's a systemic issue. It starts at the top, and it's been ongoing for a long time. It's observed in these different geographies. I've cited some Italian and French. I think gotta cite Dante, it's the most famous one. But it's not limited to, let's say, one event, one pope, one person, one place. This is an ongoing issue. And it's not random. It's not only one class. It's not only one or two or three just kind of offhand people. Some of them are even named, as in Dante. Long-standing issues, long-standing corruption, and greed is again the through line here with the anti-papal literature. So in the anti-clerical and in the anti-papal, there's a lot of humor used. That's mostly the vehicle, I would say, for expressing this kind of sentiment, which makes sense, right? Because if you're a good Roman Catholic or you're, dedicated to the Roman Catholic Church, you're not maybe wanting to have a whole new church started, but certainly you have some issues, but you don't have the authority to make any change. And the Roman Catholic Church is incredibly powerful, very influential. So, making jokes about something without naming anybody specific is a little safer. Dante really didn't have much to lose because he'd already been exiled, so why not just name some popes and put them in hell? But you see that humor is a constant through line in all these works, and citing greed over and over and over again in all these places throughout all these times, still an issue. So let's move on to the next slide, please. Now, what's the impact in the period of reading this kind of thing? It's really hard to say, like a chicken or egg kind of a thing. Did reading these works of literature inspire other people? Do we know if Wycliffe read Dante? I don't know, really doubt it, but just an example. I think it's less necessary to determine, okay, who read these works and what did they take away from it. I think it's better to ask a little more generally two questions. What's the effect of reading this kind of work if you're somebody who's already struggling with these observations about what's going on in your religion? What's the effect on you as a reader? Somebody who's probably experiencing similar things, but maybe hadn't given voice to it or hadn't noticed that other people were noticing, although you probably did. And then the other question is, just escaped me. Oh yes, why are we seeing such similar portrayals across all these places, times, different modes of literature? Why is greed such a through line? So again, rather than saying who reads this and then what's the effect of reading Chaucer's representations, or who's reading Dante and did that inspire them to question the Pope? I mean, maybe, but more interesting is, why is this so common already? And I think my impression is that there's something in the groundwater already that's leading to these representations being so common. I mean, that sounds like a kind of obvious point, maybe, but as we clarified at the beginning of this talk, there is a kind of a pseudo-historical meme that this Reformation just kind of came out of nowhere. And, well, yes, I think Luther is vital to starting the 1517 Reformation in the way that we would say, George Washington was vital to the Revolutionary War. It's hard to imagine the Revolutionary War without him. It would also be just as weird to say, well, the Revolutionary War happened because George Washington just decided that it should. Like, that, it just happened, one day, let's say 1776, July 4th, and then it took off from there. Like, no, there were lots of historical things happening prior to that. There were lots of different issues from a lot of different angles in different places that were all contributing to this major shift. It's unrealistic to point to a major historical event, this major watershed moment theologically, politically, socially, culturally, and say that it just kind of happened all at once. Not everybody makes that claim. There are some people who are intellectually honest about it. But yeah, I have also noticed this weird kind of meme that Luther just kind of haphazardly started the Reformation one day, and that was where it came from. I also have some images here that I want to speak to. I think maybe starts getting some actual, maybe institutional change going. Wycliffe isn't featured here. He's a proto-reformer in England, but I do have Margery, Kempe, and Julian of Norwich here. These are also late medieval, just like the other works that I've cited. These are late medieval figures, actual historical figures. They're writing about their visions. The Julian Norwich's Shewings, which is like a vision. And these women are often interpreted as writing things that are not canonically theologically correct, but they kind of get to Julian Norwich's anchoress, excuse me. They kind of get to have these visions and express them and circulate them outside of ecclesiastical authority, outside of the bounds of ecclesiastical authority. And you see this explosion, speaking of Julian of Norwich, you see this explosion of anchoresses. An anchoress or an anchorite is somebody who locks themselves in a room for devotional purposes. It could be to constantly observe the Eucharist, it could just be in prayer, but it's an extreme and isolated cloistering of oneself. Women start to do this more and more, especially in the later Middle Ages, far more female than male anchorites. And why I put these women here is not because I think they read Chaucer and then, decided to go off and start doing things outside of the bounds of ecclesiastical authority. They weren't, starting their own church movements, but they did kind of toe the line, kind of go on the line of being a little bit outside of the bounds of what's typically done within the church, having their own writings, having almost new revelations about Christ, or at least this kind of beatific experience of getting to talk with him personally or experience his body personally even. This is all to say that I think the cultural impact of this widespread dissatisfaction with how things were going, both at the bottom and at the top levels of the Roman Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, I think a byproduct of that is you have, in part, women like Margery, Kempe, and Julian of Norwich going off and kind of not needing priests, kind of looking for ways to interact with God without all these different middlemen that the Roman Catholic Church has started to create. And then I have this little Reynard the Fox image here. Reynard the Fox is just kind of, he's, speaking of memes, he's a kind of cultural meme. He gets borrowed in all these different kinds of literature, but he's in there might be a Franciscan hood. It's certainly some kind of friar's hood there, where he's this trickster figure and he's also dressed like a friar. So I think, again, it's another image of the widespread deceptive person who also dresses in the robes of a cleric, aka you can't always trust clerics because they're greedy and they're probably trying to trick you. Do I think that anybody who expressed any kind of anti-clerical or anti-papal sentiment wanted to demolish the Catholic Church? No. Do I think that they had real serious concerns or troubles with or struggled with or resentments against even? Not just one or two people within the Catholic Church, but the institution as a whole across swaths of Europe? Yeah, I think we can say that. I mean, I'm willing to have a conversation about it, but I think certainly you can't ignore even just these, handful of examples that I gave. Everywhere that we see it, I think you can't ignore that there was something very seriously wrong with the church as an institution at that point. And I'd like to go on to some takeaways for today that I can imagine. So, what do we do with all this? Why do we care? If you're already somebody who doesn't believe that the 1517 Reformation was this kind of out of the blue event, why care? Well, I mean, if you do, hopefully you've been persuaded, but otherwise, I wanted to highlight that history is complicated. There's not, I've said the word like the church as an institution. I've used those phrases kind of loosely. It's convenient for when I'm just trying to speak and make some points quickly. But even then, like, what do we mean when we say the church? Are we talking about just the on-the-ground people that we deal with on a day-to-day basis. For many people, that was the church. Who was meeting the Pope regularly? Who was interacting with the bishops and cardinals on a day-to-day basis? You're just trying to go and confess your sins because that's what you're supposed to do, and you're going to your maybe annual communion where you're just getting the body of Christ. You're not dealing with all these different things. So we talk about the church, whatever we mean by that. It's not so simple as just, okay, one institution, the Pope said something and it affects everybody else. No, it's important to remember that there are all these different moving parts and all these different components. Likewise, you don't just have pre-Reformation and post-Reformation. Things were one way, Reformation happened, boom, things are another way. There are so many big schisms and things happening, positive and negative, depending on who you ask, happening in the Roman Catholic Church and in the Eastern Church and in the French papacy and in the Roman papacy. Prior to the Reformation, there's already lots of instability. There's also political instability that I'm sure didn't, help the Roman Catholics any. And so you also already have all this corruption that you can't really blame on the Eastern Church. You can't really blame the fact that all your friars and monks and nuns are regarded with suspicion, or are often regarded with suspicion at least. You can't blame that on Wycliffe. You can't blame that on the Avignon papacy. You can't blame that on the Eastern Church. There's something far deeper and much more widespread, even if you chalk it up to exaggeration for humorous effect. Again, why is it humorous? Why are memes funny that we share? Because we understand that even if they are a little bit exaggerated, we know exactly that they're speaking to something that we're dealing with. And so anti-clerical and anti-papal, again, did not necessarily mean anti-Roman Catholic Church, in that, I don't think that Dante would have been helping on with Luther, let's say. But that doesn't mean that they just didn't do anything about it because they loved the way that things were so much. I mean, there's probably something to be said for the fact that many of these people I've cited couldn't do anything about the way things were in the church, even if they wanted to. These tensions are also long-standing. These conflicts we're seeing play out, these different examples I gave, there's an extant and ongoing dissatisfaction across sometimes hundreds of years. And this is across Europe as well. This is definitely worth looking into, and not pretending like 1517 was just a kickoff point where we all of a sudden started realizing that there were problems. This was not when we started realizing that there were problems within the Roman Catholic Church. Finally, the Reformation is ongoing even to today. So certainly, I give the example and kind of parallel of the American Revolutionary War. Yes, it was dramatic and effective. Yes, we can say that Luther, like George Washington, was such a staple in this event that it's hard to imagine things going on without him. That doesn't mean, though, that these things never would have happened without these people, right? It's hard to imagine once we actually see the full scope of dissatisfaction, observations about corruption, even from very faithful Roman Catholics. When we see this long-standing pattern, it's hard to imagine the Reformation as being anything but inevitable. I haven't even gotten into the different theological arguments, the scholastic arguments, which is less so my field, but something I have some facility in. But even just looking at the literature alone, it's hard to imagine there not being some kind of boiling point, if you want to call it that. And so the medieval authors also remind us that reform is an ongoing process, and that we can also feel free to call out issues within our own church, within our own church bodies. And that I do think that this is maybe less to do with the literature and more my own musings, but I do think that in reading this constant critiquing and also desire for change, that we should be still trying to continue the Reformation. We, as Lutherans, there's no reason that the Reformation needs to be done. The Reformation is not the thing that happened at 1517. I've already made the case literarily for why I think there were so many tensions and such a baked-in dissatisfaction with the way things were, which tells me that 1517 was not just this snap thing that happened and then it was done. But if that's not the case leading up into the Reformation, why should it be the case after? Why should we say, okay, well, the Reformation was this one event, and it was a one-off, and Luther did that, and now it's done because Luther's dead, and Melanchthon's dead, and everybody else. No, I don't think we need to view it as being done either. So that's my spiel on medieval literature, the anti-clerical and anti-papal exempla, and yeah, I think you have some questions. I am happy to address any
Yeah.
other questions that came up during the talk, but
Thank you
those are
so
my
much.
thoughts.
Thank you so much for that
Yeah.
presentation. Before we jump into the questions that I sent you beforehand here, something that I probably should have asked prior to your presentation, but I might as well now, is how did you become interested in medieval literature? How did you get to a place where you're studying all these various things, or you have your channel that you started? I believe you even have a video, right? Like reading Middle English and doing these sorts of
Hmm.
things. It's not like a very common sort of career path. And so, how did you become interested in medieval literature, and how did you get into this field?
Sure. So I loved writing in high school, and I really thought I wanted to do creative writing, which is just as promising a career field as medieval literature. And I ended up going to community college and transferring to UCLA. I was dead set on doing creative writing, and then I didn't get into the creative writing program, so I had to fall back on this backup class, which was at the time Dante in English, and I was taking it. And I was taking some other classes too in the English department. But what struck me was that I could study theology and also study literature kind of at the same time when studying medieval literature. Like, you just kind of have to have facility with both. And the creative writing thing being what it was, I still enjoyed writing, and I get to do that, but in a different way. With scholarly writing, it's not the same as creative necessarily, but that was my intro to medieval literature. Was, oh, like, I'm at a place here. This is also, it's kind of elite-ish academic environment where, whether it's fair or not, one anticipates as a Christian maybe not having everybody be totally familiar with or sympathetic to your beliefs. But you're in a place where you're studying medieval literature, and even your professors, they're not believers, but we're treating Christianity, whether it's Roman Catholic or whatnot, we're treating it as a real serious philosophical position that has merits and has a rationale to it. And it's not, bad to talk about it. It's not, you're stupid or unacademic to be religious in that space. Um, so that was how I got really comfortable with medieval literature. And because I was already in English, I kind of went in the direction of English, but I've had the chance to work on some Italian stuff too.
Cool. Yeah, no, I always find it interesting how people end up where they are, because I feel
Hmm.
like, I don't know, most people's stories, sometimes it is as easy as like, I knew I wanted to do this from the very get go, and so I studied it, and that's what I do. But I find that a lot of the time there tend to be kind of like these twists and turns, before people end up where
Hmm.
they are. So,
Hmm.
well, jumping into the questions I sent you beforehand regarding this topic.
Hmm.
So, why did so many people during the Middle Ages choose to comment on, and you covered this a little bit, but maybe we go into this a little bit more in depth. Why did
Hmm.
so many of these people choose to comment on clerical and papal corruption through the mediums of fiction, poem, or satire? What advantages do these mediums have over something more direct and academic, like, say, a theological or a philosophical treatise?
Sure. So I think that just depends on your position. If you're a random clerk, or not necessarily random, but if you're Chaucer and you're a clerk in the court, you're not going to be um in the scholastic debates of the day per se. You're Dante, and you're more of a political poet, and you're a faithful Roman Catholic, but you're not somebody who's actually, canonized. You're not an actual cleric. So I think part of it just depends on these positions. The people who are writing works of literature are not going to be writing theological treatises, and vice versa. You do have some people. I gave one example of a cleric who did write works of fiction, so that happens. But I think um, it's not like, oh, they could have written theological treatises, but they chose to write satire. They were just already poets, and they were already, making these observations, and those were the genres they were already working in. I think that you get humor a lot, and I kind of alluded to this in my talk, that I think you get humor a lot because it's, in different reasons, it's relatable. Things that are funny, you lean on what people know. You also have, with satire, the ability to kind of condemn in the general without naming anybody in the particular, and that saves you from any backlash from a particular person that you might be criticizing. But you also still, because you're not naming anybody specific, you likewise, as the satirist, get to generalize the problem is actually more widespread. So it's not just one person that I'm naming who would then maybe have some backlash against me. It's anybody. And that speaks to the widespreadness of the problem.
Yeah, I would also wonder, to your point, when it comes to things like humor or like, a memorable story, if this also kind of helps drive the point home in a much more memorable way than maybe something like I'm going to sit down and and read again a theological or
Mm-hmm.
philosophical or scholastic treatise, because I think about, like, even in a modern context. Now this is different from like a literary work, but even you referenced quite a few times like memes and that sort of thing. I'll have a bunch of memes on my channel, but it's something interesting that I find, and I'm curious if you would agree that there's something about, again, being able to poke fun at something, or being able to, uh, um, whether in general terms or whether aimed at a specific type of person or person. I feel like there's something more powerful at kind of like breaking the spell that a given ideology has on somebody, when you're able to kind of poke fun at a thing, especially if you're actually coming from a place of legitimacy, right? If you're not just making something up. Does that make sense?
I think so. Yeah, the demystifying of the thing that you're mocking, even if you are, let's say, still dedicated to it. I think the image of the monks or the friars, excuse me, flying out of Satan's ass. This is the it's that's going to stick with you more than saying, "Oh, well, look at all these different friars who are having all these issues."
Yeah.
Or like, yeah, you might be aware of it, but it's funny, it's visceral, and yeah, you also have to think the theological treatise is probably not going to be read aloud for fun at court at a dinner the way that a romance or any of these frame tales that I mentioned might be. So you also have, I think, a kind of the effect of the humor is that you have a bigger audience than just one person reading to himself. So it works better too, I think, just for the audience that question in question.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, is there a particular trend in the background of these medieval writers that binds them all together? So you mentioned, for example, right, that it's not like you have a bunch of peasants doing this, because most peasants
Hmm.
are illiterate, right? But
Hmm.
is there something that binds these sort of medieval writers together, as such as like class, political involvement, etc., or does this anti-papal, anti-clerical sentiment extend across classes to people who come from all backgrounds and walks of life?
Yeah, it's a good question. You're not going to have a huge, the full range of medieval society represented because, as we just clarified, only certain people can write. So, I didn't mention any women. More, if you were going to be literate, you're going to be a man. That doesn't mean that all men or most men were literate, even, but so you're not getting a huge representation of society. That being said, with works of literature like this, let's say Canterbury Tales, this isn't like, oh, the king is going to be listening to this and that's the audience. No, you might have some landed gentry, but they're not super powerful people here. So I mean, there's a degree of wealth that the peasantry wouldn't have, but you're also not featuring, or you're not getting the ear of the most powerful people either. I'm not going to call it the middle class because that wouldn't be quite accurate, but it's not only the most powerful are having these conversations is what I'm trying to say. Um, yeah, something else that I haven't been able to. I mean, I have some kind of general historical ideas about, but you'll notice, and I briefly mentioned the time periods for each of these works, but they're all kind of clustered around the 14th century. Some of them in the 13th. Roman de la Rose is also 13th, I think. Yes. And why is that? I mean, your post your post-Western schism at this point, I believe, for probably most of them. Maybe that has something to do with it. There's also the social, political unrest. You have the plague. You have in England, there's the Peasants' Revolt. So there are other just kind of dissatisfactions and forms of discontent towards authority in general. But I think that would be a bit of a cop out for the papacy because, as I mentioned, I think there are some longer standing issues that predate those concerns and in different terrains. So you can't all just chalk it up to one event or one or two events, even. But yeah, the other through line would be maybe similar classes. Yes, I would have to look into the biographies of everybody, but certainly I think the time period is speaking to, wherever they are, whatever their class situation is, there are a lot of historical factors kind of combining to make vocal critiques of clerics and the papacy at large maybe easier, maybe more popular, and more relatable for their audiences.
Yeah, and one would think that even if it's not peasants writing these stories or necessarily reading them like you said, at parties and dinners and such, uh,
Mhm.
something that I like you pointed out in your presentation a couple different times is that in order for the joke to work, in order for these references to work, it needs to be something that everyone is more or less aware of, right? And something that everybody is kind of dealing with. Otherwise, the jokes wouldn't make any sense, right? Or their constant involvement, especially because you cited, I believe, right, a few sources from England, France, and Spain, right? And so that's interesting too,
Mhm.
because to your point, right? It's not like it's a conspiracy. It's not like you have just a couple of, I don't know, upset politicians or what have you from the same town putting this together, but it's people across these vast distances having, or rather, appealing to what should be this sort of general experience of the people dealing with corruption in order to make their satires.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah, the some of these examples too, you'll see like in Chaucer, might have a partner or somebody going to confess somebody else, but the examples are also not just interactions with landed gentry, excuse me. You have images of kind of poorer people or peasants interacting with, let's say a partner who's coming to confess and they're trying to figure out what money they can give. So you have in the example, even if Chaucer himself is not quite in that position, it seems like they're pointing to a reality that other people, not just this higher level, ecclesiastical structure, but other people lower in socioeconomic status, would be also troubled by this kind of rampant corruption.
So, do these forms of literary anti-papal and anti-clericalist criticisms evolve over the Middle Ages? How would you compare them to Reformation era literature and use of satire? Because the Reformers used plenty of satire, especially at that point you actually have the printing press, right? And so there's a lot of these sorts of
Hmm.
caricatures and things going around. I think of the this isn't literature per se; it's more like a picture. But I think of even like the early 2000s Luther movie where they show the very real caricature that was made of Cajetan, as like a butt wearing like a cardinal's hat and playing a harp, I believe, or
Hmm.
something like that, right? And so you have plenty of that stuff even at the time of the Reformation going around. So how would I guess did this evolve over time, and then how would you compare these sort of late medieval criticisms to Reformation era literature?
Sure. So, getting into more Reformation era literature that's more like what's in my personal reading and interest. So it's less of my like concentrated research focus. So if I start kind of getting vaguer, that's why. But I think I mean it seems like it would make sense that because you now have an actual movement with a lot of momentum that's spreading, that the satire would get a lot more pointed and targeting actual maybe specific people, with your example. With the satires you see that are late medieval from, actual papists, it's rare that very specific people are getting mentioned and named. It's a little bit safer, as I alluded to before, to kind of point at the problem in general. With Reformation era, like post 1517 era satire and other kinds of literature or art, um, it seems a lot more pointed and specific and less about here's a funny meme, but here it's almost like it's written or presented as a justification for the Reformation as a movement versus there's not always a point to the satire of the late medieval era. Not always a point, meaning they're not trying to affirm some kind of ongoing reform effort necessarily. It's just kind of poking fun for the sake of poking fun. Whereas after or once the Reformation gets going, I think there's a real movement purpose behind those works. There are actual goals there, I think.
How would you evaluate the critiques of famous anti-clerical corruption figures, such as Girolamo Savonarola, or that of even the famous humanist Erasmus, in relation to these earlier writers as relates to their criticisms of the Pope?
Yeah, I think similar to what we were just discussing, I think with Savonarola and Erasmus, you have more with Savonarola, you would have I don't want to say revolutionary, but he had more of a movement kind of in mind, I think, than your Chaucer or your Dante. Um, he was preaching on actual change that he needed to or believed needed to be made. I think there were like the bonfires in Florence or something. This is where I'm starting to get a little bit out of my element. And then Erasmus, also has some very interesting works of literature that are not just treatises. But similarly, I think he's speaking to and engaging with the actual ongoing efforts, and he's not he doesn't agree with Luther, so we're not really kind of lumping him in together. But nevertheless, I think there's a different response and a different tone to the post-Reformation literature where we're actually really grappling with the fact that things could be changing or dismantling, and what are we doing with that? Versus again that late medieval stuff, which again is really kind of clustered around the late medieval area. It's hard to find examples. It's hard for me to find examples, at least, and I'm happy to be corrected, of anything kind of early medieval or even in the high Middle Ages. But anyway, in this late medieval period, you are getting this more tone of, I think, angst and frustration, but there's almost like not a specific object for it. Even Dante, he's putting popes in hell, but the popes are dead already. So post-Reformation, we have actual living people that we're contending with. And there's a danger to that too, right? Because the satire, again, if it's vague, you're not going to get probably a lot of backlash. Now you're actually pointing out specific people and you're dealing with living, nameable, knowable clerics and even, other leaders, higher up leaders. And so that's more of a general answer to your question, but I think there's a big tone shift because A, there's actual momentum behind the Reformation and reform efforts, and B, I think we're getting more specific now, we're getting more antagonistic, I think, as a consequence, because now we know exactly who is opposing the Reformation.
To what extent do you see the Counter Reformation trying to address some of the problems pointed out and critiqued in these various works, such as greed, simony, sexual immorality, and the like? And how would you describe and assess the Lutheran Reformation's addressing of these problems?
hmm So, I mean, thinking of at least historical examples, I know Council of Trent was supposed to address some of these longstanding concerns. I think a little too late. Um, but yeah, I think Counter Reformation didn't. I think they probably saw the change. The Roman Catholic Church, the papacy, was viewing change as an institutional effort. So the whole priority is let's keep the institution together almost at all costs, and let's just rearrange some things going on within the institution in order to alleviate some of these concerns about corruptions and abuse of power. Whereas what I see the reformers doing is a fundamental theological shift and a philosophical shift about how the church should be organized, and then I think the institutional changes followed suit. Um, I think the I don't think they changed the sacramental theology from Roman Catholicism to, let's say, Lutheranism. I don't think that they made those changes in order to sidestep abuses of power and the greed and the corruption, but I do think that a byproduct of returning to baptism, the Eucharist, confession, and absolution, depending on who you ask, I think that returning to these sacraments helps to sidestep some of the concerns that I mentioned, like the pardoner going and getting money from people traveling around to get confessions, um, sidestepping other concern and the kind of yes, you still need the priest to facilitate these sacraments, but there is there's less salvific authority imbued into all these different middlemen, and as a consequence of the Reformation and coming at it from more of the Lutheran angle, I think you're also alleviating the burden from on the people of having to deal with all these different people, all these different middlemen, all these different clerics who are scamming them. Is it absolutely everybody? No, but it was again a widespread problem, and so I think the sacramental reform, as an example, also helps to, and of course the arguments against the monasteries and the whole monastic life. You are taking a burden off of everyday Christians who no longer have to deal with all these different people who are, yeah, trying to abuse power and take advantage of them. This is less of a literary answer because again, yeah, I mean, I can think of some like what is Fox's Book of the Martyrs? That's more of a Catholic thing. I'm not sure that it really addresses the question here, but anyway, yeah, I think the papists tried to address the problems by preserving the institution and making institutional rearrangements. And I think the reformers addressed the longstanding problems that I expressed that were in the literature by having a fundamental theological reorientation towards and around scripture primarily and principally. So yeah, I think those are the big counter-Reformation, Reformation responses I would name.
Yeah, and I think especially from a Lutheran perspective, when we can say that the institution itself isn't infallible or producing these sort of infallible, unreformable, or irreformable rather, statements and all these sorts of things, it becomes, I think, a
Mm-hmm.
lot easier. Not that we're perfect by any means at all, right? I mean, you have
Mm-hmm.
entire Lutheran bodies and such that much later would fall to liberalism and these sorts of things. Like everybody
Mm-hmm.
deals with those. But I think
Mm-hmm.
when you have this attitude of, well, actually no, we should be reforming, we should be reforming in accordance with the scriptures, and we need to put away unbiblical practices that actually may contribute to these sort of sins running rampant, right? And when you have again indulgences where you can get time off purgatory, right, by
Mm-hmm.
getting access to the treasury of merit being opened for you, and you receive these, and one of the many ways that you can do this is by giving an offering or out of money to the
Mm-hmm.
church. Or by, I'm going to go on pilgrimages and visit all these different relics, and it's customary that I give them money when I'm there, right?
Mm-hmm.
As I view these relics and all these sorts of fun technicalities, right? It's not really fun, but technicalities for, oh, well, we're not really charging for this necessarily, but wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We expect you to pay us for doing this. I think when you, to your point, take away a lot of these unbiblical sort of middlemen, uh, it becomes a lot harder to just siphon money off of people. Same way with when it comes to the private masses and masses for the dead and all of these sorts of things. I think when you take away a lot of the money incentive, or rather, when you take away a lot of the things that are attached to the money incentive, it becomes harder
Mm-hmm.
to take money away from people. You know, and so, well, as we approach here our final question, and I guess I kind of touched on this a little bit at the beginning here to close out. Do you see a role for these sorts of literary critiques in apologetics today? As Christians, what might a right use of these styles of literature look like?
Man, I think the right and the wrong answer is memes. I think that's the new way of poking fun at everything. Because I think long form novels about reform are maybe not going to spread super far. Maybe they will, who knows? But I think that it's important to be able to, if you're trying to reach people, yeah, I guess it depends on the conversation you're wanting to have. I think if we're still going to insist the Reformation is ongoing and that we can still reform the papacy, and I believe we can. um, uh, Not optimistically, but I believe we can. I think that reaching people with humor without targeting specifics usually goes over better socially. So if that's the intent, then remembering the congenial power and persuasiveness of a good joke, I think, is worth remembering. Though I don't know, I do wonder if there is a lack, I think, of, I'm thinking of the LCMS or just kind of confessional Lutheran circles in the US and in the world. There's not, a big cultural presence. There's not a lot of cultural production. The LCMS has Concordia Publishing House, which is not the bastion of creative flow that's going to reach the masses, let's say. Love CPH, but I I do think that rather than getting into little dog fights on Twitter, which I am also good for, I think rather than just getting stuck there, producing things that are enjoyable and entertaining, and what would that look like to be able to produce something that's enjoyable and entertaining and confessionally Lutheran? I mean, Lutheran satire has been doing that, and they actually have done pretty well with it. So I think there's something to be said for not just critiquing, not just complaining, but producing something creatively that, yeah, can poke fun and maybe we can address some problems too, but you're just going to reach people better with a story. If you made that point earlier that this is going to be more memorable than a treatise, I think that's probably why, in part, God has given so much of Scripture to us in the form of a narrative. It's not. I don't say that as if it's invented, but it is. There is a story, and there's an overarching story to it. Um, so, yeah, what can we do with that? I mean, I think look to, like I said, Lutheran satire is a good example. I think non-Lutheran examples, but other Christian media today, like The Chosen, has taken off for, it's not without its own problems, but I think there is an interest from confessional Christians that covers different territory, but from different Christians to positively create media that can reach people in different ways. That's not just about complaining and saying, oh, well, the culture's against us, so we can't really do anything about it. Let's just kind of form our little cliques online and have infighting that the rest of the world can see now observes Lutherans and Papists getting all mad at each other, which again, I'm part of that problem too. But a long-winded answer to your question, but I do think that actual creative production could be helpful in starting productive conversations.
Yeah, to your point, I think our Lord is the greatest storyteller of all, right? I mean, what
Hmm.
is creation and what is life? But all of these different stories that He's woven together, and I think if we're made in His image, there's a reason why we resonate so much with good stories, right? When we resonate so much with a beautiful poem or captivating imagery. I think about my Anglican friends, especially
Hmm.
my more like Anglo-Catholic friends, who sometimes will be so
Hmm.
upset that like, why is C.S. Lewis the only one of our figures that like anybody knows? And I'm like, well, I mean, he was a good storyteller, right? And he was a
Hmm.
wordsmith, and he had a way with words, and that resonates with people, right? And there's been countless people, even just with C.S. Lewis as an example, who have gone from being atheists to becoming Christians, or maybe have gone from being lukewarm Christians to actually being active and spiritually healthy Christians, whether they become Anglican or not, right? And so,
Hmm.
to your point, right, there's something about not just stories, but then also having a positive vision, right? Where I think, and this is, this applies to me as well, right? Where sometimes it's easy to get caught up in just the polemics, and polemics are important, right? And pointing out where the other side's issues are is supremely
Sure.
important, but also. if all we're doing is just attacking the other side and we never provide like a vision for like, hey, here's what we are fighting for. Here is where we're going to take our stand, and this is what's beautiful about what we have to offer. Then I don't think we should be surprised if not many people are convinced, right? By even if our critiques are devastating, even if our critiques are really good, I think if we don't give a positive vision for the average person, it may be harder to relay. Does that make sense?
I think it absolutely does, yeah. And we also remember that God spoke the world into being. This is a creator who it speaks and uses words to in such a way that like it's hard to even imagine. I mean, we can describe something and it can inspire like something, an image in your head, but that's not the same as bringing it forth into existence. I think there's something about the creative potential of language itself that we see throughout scripture that's it's so fascinating. I think it's why that literature is again such a beautiful field of study. But yeah, I agree that I think there needs to be a constructive element to building up our confessional Lutheran community. Let's say it's not just what are other people doing wrong. Yeah, I C.S. Lewis. You have Tolkien, who also is probably the best modern Catholic author that we have, or at least in the modern era. I know he's not alive anymore, but uh, these people are popular for a reason, and no matter your denomination, and even if you're not a Christian, and it speaks to, like you were saying, I think the power of a good story to inspire interest and also to make you feel, and not just feel, but think through your lived experience as a human being and ask broader questions beyond your immediate reality. And I think that's something else that stories do is they defamiliarize your immediate context by, let's say, situating characters in Narnia or in Middle Earth. But through that process of defamiliarization, you get to reflect on the, let's say, a virtuous journey or a struggle with temptation in a way that's familiar with you, but it's just dissimilar enough to make you think about it in a new way. So, like the One Ring, for example, that it's kind of weird the idea that like a ring would draw you so much, but it's it's not even like a metaphor. It's another example of how strong this pull to corruption and sin is, and you don't have to have studied lots of theology in order to get that if you're a living human being who's had any kind of struggle with that. So yeah, these are that's a tall order for Lutherans to be the next, Tolkien or Lewis. I don't think we need to be though. I do think that, and I put myself in the spot here too. I think that doing more than just complaining or poking fun, but making actual enjoyable, I don't know, content, memes, stories, but something beyond the dog fights that we see.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Megan, thank you so much once again for your presentation here on my channel today. One more time, everybody at home, you can find Megan's public facing work on YouTube and X under the handle at Megievalist, if I can take a shot at trying to pronounce that.
Yep.
I will go ahead and
Yep.
link your channel down below. I'll also try to link
Thank
down
you.
below. I should have asked you this before we filmed, but I forgot. Is if you can send me a list of some of these sources, like the ones that you kind of referenced today, that we can list for
Sure.
people down below as well. We'll try to make that available for everybody. But thank you so
Will
much.
do.
Is there anything else you'd like to share before we head out?
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and we'll see you later.